must be very happy about that.
Well, relieved more than anything. I think it'll be good for her to get away from the emergencies and tragedies.
I just want to say, you do in the summer.
Really?
You do that when she graduates.
The clan is here. It's time to get it, Bobby. It's 1,000 of us out here, no lie. In the water for you, baby.
Okay, sis.
For you, baby. For you, baby. I'm going to always represent my sister. Name.
She over there.
This was cold. Yeet, yeet, yeet. This is...
What if I told you that a woman survived being shot in the head by her partner in 2020, spent years recovering from that trauma, and then in 2024 made the decision to move back in with the same man who nearly killed her? And what if I told you that by February 2025, she was dead? This isn't fiction. This isn't a movie plot. This is the devastating true story of Briekethia Pruitt, and it's a case that has forced America to confront some of the most difficult questions about love, survival, and the choices we make when we're desperate for hope. Today, we're going to explore a story that challenges everything we think we know about human nature and relationships. Because when you hear what happened to Briekethia, you're going to ask yourself the same question that everyone else has been asking. How could someone make that choice? Briekethia Pruitt wasn't just a name in a police report. She wasn't just another headline that flashed across your screen for 30 seconds before you scrolled to the next story. She was a real person with a real life. And the people who knew her will tell you that she was extraordinary in the most ordinary way possible. In Cleveland's close-knit communities, Briekethia was the kind of person who made everyone feel like family. She had this gift, this ability to walk into a room and immediately make it warmer, more welcoming. Her smile wasn't just polite, it was genuine, the kind that reached her eyes and made you feel like you mattered. As a mother, Briekethia was devoted beyond measure. She poured her heart into raising her children, always putting their needs before her own. She believed in them when they didn't believe in themselves, celebrated their victories as if they were her own, and stood by them through every challenge life threw their way. Her love wasn't conditional or complicated. It was pure, consistent, and unwavering. But perhaps nowhere was Briekethia's heart more evident than in her role as a grandmother. Her grandchildren weren't just the light of her life. They were her entire world. She would spend hours playing with them, reading to them, teaching them about kindness and resilience. She wanted them to have everything she never had: safety, security, and the unshakable knowledge that they were loved. Her sister Nicole Geiger often spoke about how Briekethia was the backbone of their family. When things got tough, everyone turned to Briekethia. When celebrations needed organizing, Briekethia stepped up. When someone needed a shoulder to cry on or a voice of encouragement, Briekethia was there. She wasn't just Nicole's sister. She was her best friend, her confidant, and her hero. The bond between these two women was something special. They shared everything: dreams, fears, inside jokes, and an understanding that went deeper than words. Nicole would later say that Briekethia had this incredible ability to find hope in the darkest situations, to see potential for good even when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. Briekethia's resilience was legendary among those who knew her. Life had thrown her more curveballs than anyone deserved, but she never stayed down for long. She had this quiet strength, this determination to keep moving forward no matter what obstacles stood in her way. It wasn't that she was naive or overly optimistic, she just refused to let circumstances define her. In her community, Briekethia was known for her generous spirit. She was the neighbor who checked on elderly residents, a friend who brought meals when someone was sick, the woman who remembered everyone's birthday, and always had encouraging words when they were needed most. She made Cleveland a little bit brighter just by being there. Those who loved Briekethia often talked about her dreams. They weren't grand or elaborate. She didn't want fame or fortune. She wanted stability for her family. She wanted her children to have opportunities she never had. She wanted her grandchildren to grow up feeling safe and secure. Most of all, she wanted to build something lasting, something beautiful, something that would outlive her and give meaning to all the struggles she had endured. Before we continue with Briekethia's story, I want to ask you something. Family relationships can be incredibly complex, and the bonds we form with the people we love often define who we become. Think about the person in your family who means the most to you, the one you'd do anything for. Drop a comment below and tell me about that person, and while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from today. To understand what happened to Briekethia Pruitt in 2025, we need to go back 5 years to when her life changed forever. In 2020, she was involved with a man named Corey Sanders, a relationship that would prove to be the most dangerous decision she ever made. Corey Sanders was not the kind of man who immediately raised red flags. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary guy navigating life in Cleveland. But beneath that exterior lay something far more troubling, a capacity for violence that would eventually explode in the most horrific way possible. The attack happened during what started as a typical argument between the couple. But this wasn't going to end with raised voices or someone storming out of the room. This was going to end with Briekethia fighting for her life. Sanders' rage escalated quickly that day. What began as verbal conflict transformed into physical violence when he wrapped his hands around Briekethia's throat. She fought back with everything she had, but Sanders was stronger, and his grip tightened around her neck as she struggled to breathe. But the strangling wasn't enough for Sanders. In a moment that would haunt everyone who heard about it later, he made the decision to grab a gun. With Briekethia already weakened from the attack on her throat, Sanders pointed the weapon directly at her head and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through Briekethia's skull, and by every medical standard, she should have died instantly. The trajectory, the impact, the damage, everything pointed to this being a fatal shot. But somehow, impossibly, Briekethia's heart kept beating. Emergency responders arrived to find Briekethia clinging to life with a gunshot wound to her head. The paramedics who worked on her that day later said they had never seen anything like it. The fact that she was still breathing was nothing short of miraculous. The journey to the hospital was a race against time. Doctors prepared for the worst as Briekethia was rushed into emergency surgery. The bullet had caused massive trauma, and the medical team worked for hours to stabilize her condition. Her family was told to prepare for the possibility that she might not survive the night. But Briekethia did survive that night, and the next night, and the night after that. Her recovery was long and painful. The physical wounds were extensive, requiring multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. She had to relearn basic functions that most of us take for granted. Simple tasks like speaking clearly, walking steadily, and processing information became daily challenges that required tremendous effort and determination. The emotional scars ran even deeper than the physical ones. Briekethia experienced severe trauma from the attack, developing anxiety and sleep disturbances that would plague her for years. She jumped at sudden sounds, had difficulty trusting new people, and struggled with flashbacks that transported her back to that terrifying moment when Sanders had his hands around her throat. Meanwhile, the legal system moved forward with prosecuting Sanders for his crimes. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and other related offenses. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Briekethia's testimony, medical records documenting her injuries, and physical evidence from the crime scene all pointed to his guilt. Sanders faced the consequences of his actions in court. He was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to several years in prison. For Briekethia and her family, this felt like justice. Not just punishment for what he had done, but protection from him doing it again. The legal proceedings also meant that Sanders was prohibited from contacting Briekethia in any way. A restraining order was put in place to ensure that he could not approach her, call her, or attempt to reach her through third parties. For the first time in a long time, Briekethia could breathe a little easier knowing that Sanders was locked away and legally forbidden from entering her life again. After Sanders was sentenced and locked away, Briekethia began what many hoped would be the peaceful chapter of her life. Between 2020 and 2024, she focused on healing and moving forward. She threw herself into being the best mother and grandmother she could be, spending countless hours with her children and grandchildren, creating memories that would last a lifetime. During this period, Briekethia worked hard to rebuild her sense of security. She established new routines, developed friendships with people who had never known her during the violent relationship, and slowly began to trust that she could have a life free from fear. Her sister Nicole watched with relief as Briekethia seemed to find her footing again. Meanwhile, Sanders was serving his time in the Ohio correctional system. Prison records show that during his incarceration, he participated in various programs designed to address violent behavior. He attended anger management classes, completed educational courses, and maintained what appeared to be good conduct throughout most of his sentence. Sanders also used his time behind bars to write letters that would later become a crucial part of understanding how the 2024 reunion came to pass. These weren't random correspondence. They were carefully crafted messages expressing remorse, promising change, and painting a picture of a man who had supposedly transformed during his time in prison. The first contact between Sanders and Briekethia after his release didn't happen immediately. Sanders was released from prison in early 2024, and initially he appeared to be respecting the legal boundaries that had been established. He found housing in a different part of Cleveland, secured employment, and seemed to be making an effort to start fresh. But Sanders wasn't content to stay away permanently. Through mutual acquaintances, people who had known both of them before the 2020 incident, he began sending messages to Briekethia. These weren't direct communications that would violate any court orders, but rather carefully orchestrated third-party contacts designed to test whether she might be open to reconnecting. The messages Sanders sent through intermediaries focused heavily on his supposed transformation. He claimed that prison had given him time to reflect on his actions and that he was a completely different person now. He spoke about therapy, about finding religion, about understanding the pain he had caused and wanting to make amends. What made these messages particularly effective was that they weren't asking for forgiveness or attempting to minimize what had happened in 2020. Instead, Sanders acknowledged the severity of his actions while presenting himself as someone who had genuinely changed and grown during his incarceration. Briekethia's initial response to these overtures was exactly what her family had hoped: complete rejection. She told the mutual friends who approached her that she had no interest in any contact with Sanders and that she was building a new life that didn't include him in any capacity. But Sanders was persistent. The messages continued, each one carefully crafted to appeal to different aspects of Briekethia's personality. Some focused on his supposed spiritual transformation. Others talked about his desire to make things right with her family. Still others appealed to her compassionate nature by describing his struggles to readjust to life outside prison. The breakthrough for Sanders came when he learned that Briekethia was facing some financial difficulties in 2024. She had been struggling with medical bills related to her ongoing recovery and was having trouble making ends meet. Sanders saw this as an opportunity and began offering financial assistance through the same network of mutual friends. At first, Briekethia refused any help from Sanders. But as her financial situation became more desperate, and as Sanders continued to present himself as a changed man who simply wanted to help without expecting anything in return, she began to waver. The actual reunion happened gradually. It started with Briekethia agreeing to accept some financial help through intermediaries. Then came phone conversations where Sanders continued to express remorse and demonstrate what seemed like genuine change. Eventually, these conversations led to a face-to-face meeting. When word got out that Briekethia and Sanders were back in contact, the reaction from her family and community was immediate and intense. Nicole was devastated and angry, unable to understand how her sister could even consider giving Sanders another chance after what he had done to her. The community response was equally negative. People who had supported Briekethia through her recovery felt betrayed and confused. Some stopped speaking to her altogether, while others tried desperately to convince her that she was making a terrible mistake. February 9, 2025 started early for Briekethia Pruitt and Corey Sanders. They had been living together for several months by this point, and their daily routine had become predictable. But this Sunday morning would be different, though neither of them knew it yet. The exact sequence of events that led to Briekethia's death remains known only to Sanders, as he has never provided a complete account of what transpired inside their shared residence that morning. What investigators have been able to determine is that sometime between 5 and 6:30 a.m., a violent confrontation took place that ended with Briekethia losing her life. Sanders made the decision to remove Briekethia's body from their home. He loaded her into his vehicle, a car that would later become the key piece of evidence that tied him directly to the crime. The choice of vehicle wasn't random. It was the same car that was registered in his name, making it impossible for him to later deny ownership or connection to what happened next. The drive from their residence to the location where Briekethia's body was eventually discovered took Sanders through several Cleveland neighborhoods. He wasn't driving aimlessly. Cameras would later show his vehicle following a specific route that suggested he had a destination in mind. Sanders chose Judson Drive near East 47th Street in Cleveland's Corlett neighborhood as the final resting place for Briekethia's body. This location wasn't accidental. The street was residential but not heavily trafficked in the early morning hours, providing Sanders with the privacy he needed to abandon the vehicle without being immediately detected. At approximately 6:45 a.m., Sanders parked the car on Judson Drive and left Briekethia's body inside. He then departed the scene on foot, leaving behind what he likely hoped would appear to be an abandoned vehicle that might not be discovered for several hours or even days. But Sanders had underestimated the vigilance of the Corlett neighborhood residents. At 7:15 a.m., a local resident was taking her morning walk when she noticed the unfamiliar vehicle parked in an unusual spot on Judson Drive. The car was positioned awkwardly, not properly aligned with the curb, and something about the scene struck her as odd. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and knew the parking patterns of her neighbors. The resident approached the vehicle to get a closer look. The windows were slightly tinted, but she could make out what appeared to be a person slumped over in the driver's seat. Initially, she thought someone might have fallen asleep in their car, perhaps after a long night out. When she knocked on the window and received no response, her concern grew. She called out to the person inside, but there was no movement, no acknowledgement of her presence. That's when she noticed that something was very wrong with the way the person was positioned. At 7:32 a.m., the concerned resident called 911 to report what she had discovered. She told the dispatcher that there was an unresponsive person in a vehicle on Judson Drive and that she believed they might need medical attention. The dispatcher immediately sent both emergency medical services and police officers to the location. The first police unit arrived at 7:41 a.m. The responding officer approached the vehicle and immediately recognized that this was not a medical emergency. This was a crime scene. Briekethia Pruitt was clearly deceased, and the circumstances of her death were immediately suspicious. The officer secured the perimeter around the vehicle and called for additional units, including detectives and crime scene technicians. Within minutes, Judson Drive was transformed into an active investigation site, with yellow tape blocking off access to the area and multiple police vehicles lining the street. A detective arrived at 8:05 a.m. and took charge of the scene. The first priority was documenting everything exactly as it had been found before any evidence was disturbed. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, measurements were recorded, and a detailed log was started of everyone who entered the crime scene area. The vehicle's license plate was run through the system, and within minutes, detectives had the name of the registered owner, Corey Sanders. This information immediately shifted the investigation from a general homicide inquiry to a focused search for a specific suspect. By 8:30 a.m., the decision was made to transport the vehicle to the police impound facility, where a more thorough examination could be conducted. Briekethia's body was carefully removed and transported to the county morgue for autopsy. The discovery phase of the investigation was complete, but the work was just beginning. With Briekethia's body discovered and the vehicle registered to Corey Sanders, law enforcement had their primary suspect identified within hours. But having a name and building a prosecutable case are two entirely different challenges. The next 48 hours would prove crucial in determining whether Sanders could be held accountable for what had happened. The forensics team began processing Sanders's vehicle at the impound facility, while detectives started tracking down his current whereabouts. The car yielded immediate results: fingerprints, DNA evidence, and other physical materials that would later be analyzed in the lab. But perhaps more importantly, investigators found Sanders' cell phone had been left behind in the vehicle. This phone would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. When technicians accessed the device, they discovered a treasure trove of digital evidence that painted a clear picture of Sanders' movements on the morning of February 9th. The phone's GPS data showed his exact location throughout the early morning hours, creating an undeniable timeline of events. The GPS records revealed that Sanders had been at their shared residence until 6:15 a.m., then traveled directly to Judson Drive, arriving at 6:43 a.m. The phone remained stationary at that location for exactly 12 minutes before moving away from the scene. This data matched perfectly with the estimated time of the vehicle's abandonment. But the phone evidence went beyond just location tracking. Text messages recovered from the device showed increasingly hostile communications between Sanders and Briekethia in the days leading up to her death. These messages revealed escalating tensions and threats that established a clear motive for the crime. While the digital evidence was being processed, detectives began interviewing witnesses who had seen Sanders and Briekethia together in the days before the murder. These conversations proved invaluable in establishing Sanders as the last person to have contact with Briekethia before her death. A neighbor from their apartment complex confirmed seeing Sanders and Briekethia together on the evening of February 8th. The witness reported hearing raised voices coming from their unit around 11 p.m., followed by what sounded like furniture being moved or thrown around. This testimony helped establish that the conflict between them had begun hours before the actual murder occurred. Another witness, a convenience store clerk, reported seeing Sanders alone at approximately 7:15 a.m. on February 9th, purchasing cigarettes and appearing agitated. The store's security cameras confirmed Sanders' presence at this time, and the footage showed him looking disheveled and constantly checking his phone. This sighting occurred just 30 minutes after the GPS data showed his phone leaving the Judson Drive location. The investigation team also discovered that Sanders had made several purchases in the days following Briekethia's death that suggested he was preparing to flee. Credit card records showed transactions for a bus ticket to Detroit, new clothing, and a large quantity of cash withdrawn from an ATM. These actions indicated consciousness of guilt and helped prosecutors argue that Sanders knew exactly what he had done. Meanwhile, investigators were tracking Sanders' physical location through a combination of witness sightings and additional digital evidence. His credit card usage created a trail that led them to a residence in Garfield Heights where Sanders was staying with a distant relative who was unaware of the ongoing investigation. On February 11th, exactly 48 hours after Briekethia's body was discovered, a team of detectives surrounded the Garfield Heights residence. Sanders was inside, and when officers knocked on the door, he initially attempted to claim he was someone else. However, his identification quickly confirmed his true identity. Sanders was arrested without incident, though he immediately requested an attorney and refused to answer any questions about Briekethia's death. His calm demeanor during the arrest struck investigators as particularly unsettling, given the severity of the charges he was facing. The speed with which law enforcement was able to build their case against Sanders was remarkable. Within 2 days, they had physical evidence, digital proof of his presence at the crime scene, witness testimony placing him as the last person with Briekethia, and documentation of his suspicious behavior following her death. As Sanders was transported to the county jail, prosecutors were already beginning to assemble what they believed would be an airtight case against him. The trial of Corey Sanders began 6 months after his arrest, and from the opening statements, it was clear that the prosecution had built an overwhelming case. The courtroom was packed with Briekethia's family members, community supporters, and domestic violence advocates who had been following the case since news of her death first broke. Prosecutors methodically presented the evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. The GPS data from Sanders' phone was displayed on large screens, showing his exact movements on the morning of February 9th. The jury watched as the timeline unfolded, from his presence at their shared residence to his arrival at Judson Drive, and finally his departure from the scene. The text messages between Sanders and Briekethia in the days before her death were read aloud in court. These communications revealed the deteriorating state of their relationship and Sanders' increasingly aggressive behavior toward her. The jury heard evidence of threats, demands for money, and Sanders' anger when Briekethia tried to establish boundaries in their relationship. Witness testimony painted a picture of a man who had shown no remorse for his actions. The convenience store clerk testified about Sanders' agitated appearance shortly after abandoning Briekethia's body. The neighbor who heard the disturbance on February 8th described the sounds of violence coming from their apartment. Each witness added another layer to the prosecution's narrative. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that Sanders' presence at the scene didn't prove he had committed murder. They suggested that someone else could have killed Briekethia and used Sanders' vehicle to dispose of her body. However, this argument fell apart when confronted with the digital evidence and Sanders' own suspicious behavior following the crime. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning their verdict. Sanders was found guilty of aggravated murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdict was read, with Briekethia's family members embracing each other through tears of relief and grief. During the sentencing hearing, Briekethia's sister Nicole took the stand to deliver a victim impact statement that brought the entire courtroom to tears. She spoke about the sister she had lost, the grandmother her family would never see again, and the devastating impact Sanders' actions had on everyone who loved Briekethia. The judge sentenced Sanders to 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole. In delivering the sentence, the court noted Sanders' previous conviction for attempting to kill Briekethia in 2020 and emphasized that his actions represented a pattern of escalating violence that could not be tolerated. But the impact of Briekethia's case extended far beyond the courtroom. Her story became a rallying point for domestic violence prevention advocates across the country. The fact that she had survived Sanders' first attempt to kill her, only to be murdered by him 5 years later, highlighted massive gaps in the systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals. Nicole Geiger became a powerful voice for reform, speaking at conferences and working with legislators to strengthen laws protecting domestic violence survivors. She pushed for better monitoring of repeat offenders and improved support services for women trying to escape abusive relationships. Several states introduced legislation inspired by Briekethia's case, requiring more intensive supervision of individuals convicted of domestic violence and creating new programs to help survivors avoid returning to dangerous relationships. These Briekethia's Law initiatives aimed to prevent other families from experiencing the tragedy that had befallen the Pruitt family. The case also sparked conversations about the complex psychology of abusive relationships and why survivors sometimes return to their abusers. Domestic violence organizations used Briekethia's story to educate the public about the realities faced by abuse victims and the barriers they encounter when trying to leave dangerous situations. Today, Briekethia Pruitt is remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. Her death has led to concrete improvements in how society addresses domestic violence, and her memory continues to inspire those working to protect vulnerable individuals. If Briekethia's story has moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel to stay informed about cases like this. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and help us continue bringing attention to these important issues. Together, we can honor Briekethia's memory by working to prevent similar tragedies from happening to other families.